Chapter 50. Xavier needed some clarification on Emma's identity when Harry showed him the message, and Harry basically told him she was the mutant daughter of a businessman Harry met and that Scott had been dating her for the past 6 months. This was enough for him to believe it wasn't some kind of trap, allowing him to assemble the X-Men. Harry asked Xavier, "Want to follow me to the astral plane and scout for more info from Emma? She can't call us, but we should be able to contact her there." Xavier asked, "Can you track her through the astral plane?" "I can track my phones through the astral plane and she has one." Scouting in the astral plane was mostly useless as the astral plane did not reliably overlap with the physical plane. For example, the institute in the astral plane was far larger due to the presence of multiple telepaths. Walls and buildings were not always in the same position and distance was not accurate. However, they weren't going to use the astral plane for reference, just to find Emma and get more intel. Xavier nodded and said, "Agreed. Logan, inform the others and ask Scott to give them some details on this Ms. Frost." Logan grunted an affirmation from the side and Harry sat down in a meditative stance and took out a piece of quartz he made glow before he put it in his inventory. His astral self separated from his body and was followed by Charles's own. The astral plane didn't exactly have a color, but if one were to describe it they would probably call the space purple, and the things within were a vaporish white. Xavier was rather confused when he saw Harry pull out some astral tech and say, "She's this way." "Hold on." Xavier suddenly found himself feeling enclosed and then pulled through space as if he was in the Blackbird while it was accelerating. This was a transport system that Lockheed's race used to travel long distances through the astral plane. Though they used it for interstellar travel, Harry was just going a few hundred miles. The pulling motion stopped and they were floating in the air and saw what appeared to be Emma's signature. She was not actively using the astral plane, but all telepaths passively connected to it, which was how they would communicate with her. Overall, she appeared heavily stressed out but fine. Harry sent a mental call to Emma. "This is the Mutant Assistance Hotline. Please remain on hold until the next operator is available. Your call is very important to us." Emma sent back with an audible sigh, "A pleasure as always, Harry. I assume that is Professor Xavier traveling with you?" Harry answered, "Yup, so what's going on and how were you kidnapped?" "Collateral damage, I suppose. My father was having a meeting with Shaw and the latter was not doing so great. I suspect you have something to do with that. Whatever protections he seemed to have were missing from what I could tell." Suddenly a great big bloody robot showed up and shouted, "Mutant apprehension in progress," and nabbed Shaw. Apparently it could detect mutants and nabbed me too once it saw me. I'm currently in some kind of cell being flown over to wherever. I have no signal on my cell, but my mirror seems to have worked just fine. Her cell phone was not one of Harry's, but rather one her father gave her to keep tabs on her. Xavier put in his 2 cents, mutant detecting mutant hunting robots? Could it be the government or a private sector operation, he seemed to ask himself. Harry turned to Xavier and asked, "You wouldn't happen to have Magneto's number, would you? If we're going to raid this place, we're going to do it right, and a master of magnetism would probably be helpful." Harry knew a thing or two about the leader of the Brotherhood of Mutants from Wanda and from the time he used legilimency on Mystique. Xavier quickly answered, "No. Although I have no doubt Eric would be of assistance in the goal, I cannot set him loose on the very people he has sworn to fight." Harry rolled his eyes. Xavier seemed to be making a lot of assumptions. Harry added, "All right, can we at least bring the 3rd X-Men team and the available teachers? The former Hellions can stay and are strong enough to defend against attacks if anything happens while we're out. Last time there was an emergency like this, the available teachers had to stay behind to protect the Institute. Now with the addition of the well-trained former Hellions, the Institute had more strength to fall back on, giving Xavier more latitude." Charles nodded and said, "Agreed. Scott and the others are 16 and old enough to face the trials ahead." Harry still had a month and a half until his 16th birthday, but there wasn't a way to argue against Harry's inclusion in this mission, so that point was not mentioned. Emma added, "Do be prepared for the possibility of a trap. If they are taking me alive, that means they have enough confidence in their security to keep Shaw and myself from escaping, or they are using him as bait. In either case, expect resistance." Harry said, "Try to make yourself appear as someone else if seen by a human. When I get there, I'll erase whatever footage they have of you. Just because Shaw got outed doesn't mean you should too." Emma stated back with a little relief, "I would appreciate that." Harry used the astral tech to return himself and Xavier back to the location of their bodies and returned to the physical plane. Jean, Scott, and the others had already gathered and suited up for a fight. Though Bobby had to stay because he was down with the flu. The second team's Kitty Pryde offered to replace him since she was always around the mansion. Xavier stated, a new enemy has revealed itself, but may not yet know of us. A robot that can detect and hunt mutants has captured a mutant who had a means to contact Mr. Potter, and she is currently on her way to either a place being set up for a trap or a detention center. Our new arrivals will stay at the institute and remain on high alert to protect the students still at the school while we will mount a full-scale assault on the holding facility. Forge said, our priority should be the rescue of the captured mutants and seeing to their safe return, but we also need to find the source of these robots and see if we can take them out before they become a larger threat. We should do this in 3 teams. 1 to act as a distraction, 1 to infiltrate and rescue, and 1 to find the source of the robots. Scott added, agreed, but we should stick together at first until we learn the location of the other 2 objectives. Wolverine said, us teachers will act as the distraction then. You kids will do the infiltration. Forge, I'm guessing you and Potter will be Team 3? Harry confirmed, works for me. Scott said, Harry and Forge should stick with us to help bypass security at first. Harry, can you bring some diamonds to make those portals for when we find anyone who has been captured? Once they are safe, you 2 can finish your espionage thing. Harry and Forge shared a glance and smiled. Calling it espionage wasn't exactly inaccurate. With the plan assembled, they boarded the Blackbird and took off. Harry shared a mental conversation with Wanda, Rogue, and Jean to not hold back if things were to get hectic. All 3 had enough Obscurus particles to survive getting shot or stabbed, but he didn't want them to take chances. The only annoying thing about the trip was that Harry could only track Emma's mirror with astral tech, so to get directions he had to keep going into the astral plane over and over. Being reliant on astral tech was intentional as it made it so that only astral tech could intercept or track calls, but for situations like this it was annoying. The Blackbird parked in an abandoned train yard in a warehouse district some distance from where Emma's signal was coming from. Jean and Xavier used clairvoyance to map out the area and maintain a psychic link to all the groups. Before splitting up, Forge said, according to the readings off my equipment, this is definitely the place. It's using more juice than downtown New York, yet it's off the grid. I've got signal from hundreds of different security cameras, and they're all heavily encrypted. Harry asked, government or private sector? The type of encryption used could tell you a lot about a group's origins. Private sector, definitely. Harry sighed. Private sector paid for the good stuff, meaning hacking wasn't easy. The group Harry took down in Canada with Wolverine was technically government, which was why their stuff was so easy to get into. Comparatively speaking. Xavier conveyed into everyone's minds, I can sense dozens of guards around the complex. I can shield you from their sight, but the cameras will give away your position. Harry said, even if we're showing our hand, it's best not to reveal the existence of a telepath on our side. Logan said, I'm with the kid on this one, Charles. Quick and quiet is not the way to go on this one. We need to be loud and messy to make a point today. Aurora added, children who use force must be taught that the use of force invites the force of others. Xavier conveyed back, very well. But I ask that you keep the loss of lives to a minimum. Harry added, but keep damage to a maximum. Fallen lives become martyrs, which can be used to instill fear and get money out of investors. Damaged property has the opposite effect. Scott slightly glared at him for the fact that his justification for saving lives wasn't for the sake of the living. Warren sighed and said, he's not wrong. If this is a project from the private sector, it's getting its funding from investors. The results of tonight need to deter further investment. After finishing the plan, Harry got out 3 smoky quartz and made the infiltration group invisible. The only tech some of them had were cell phones from Brilliance, which were protected against magic, and Forge's personal tech had been protected from magic since Harry worked with him on upgrading Danger. A heavy mist started flowing into the region at Storm's command. Harry's group quietly rushed through the warehouse district to the secondary entrance Xavier spotted, and there they waited. The group invisibility spell allowed them to see each other, but if they did not arrive at the wall before the mist set in, it would give away their position while moving. Once the heavy fog was thick enough to block cameras and guards from seeing more than a few feet ahead of them, the teachers rushed for the entrance. From Harry's group, they could quickly hear the sound of gunfire and shouts. The occasional crackle of thunder echoed throughout the district. The radio clipped to the guards at the second entrance shouted, incoming hostiles, main entrance. 3 sets of guards at the second entrance rushed over to the main entrance, leaving only 3 behind. Once the coast was clear, Jean and Wanda knocked out 2 guards, while Rogue touched the strongest-looking one with an unloved hand. Since learning how to erase remnants with Forget-Me-Not's power, she could add temporary knowledge taken from others without lasting effect. The man Rogue touched collapsed when she released her finger and Rogue ripped a keycard from him and swiped it on the door. A metal panel opened revealing a keypad and a hand scanner. Rogue changed her hand using Mystique's power to that of the guard and placed it on the scanner while typing in the security code. A surge of light forced Rogue removed her hand with a wince as an electric shock went through the hand scanner. Jean asked, "Problem?" Rogue answered testily, "No, it always does that. Anti-mutant security to make sure they're not being controlled. After getting shocked, if you don't type in the correct pin, they'll know." Forge whistled as Rogue finished typing the code. "That's a lot of security for a side entrance. This type of scanner won't work on someone unconscious, and if they're controlled by a telepath, that shock would definitely wake them." Rogue said, "That's not all. Can you make me visible?" Wanda said, "I can," and dispelled the invisibility with a silent finite. Rogue continued, "Follow me and stay quiet." Rogue then completely morphed into the body double of the guard she knocked out and pressed a switch to open the door. The door opened with a heavy thunk showing the weight of the deadbolts holding the door in place. Rogue led the way having gained something of a map in her mind of the place and knew where to go. The inside of the warehouse was completely visible to everyone within. There were no walls or places to hide, so anyone within the warehouse could be seen from any location in the warehouse. A number of heads turned to see the side entrance open, but when they saw Rogue in the form of the guard walking through they turned away. Rogue stood to the side of the door as the still invisible team entered and Rogue said aloud, "If anyone approaches, shoot the lock. A breach cannot be allowed. Do you understand?" To anyone paying attention to her it looked like she was talking to someone outside the door while the door was still open. Once the last of the team was through, Rogue closed the door and kicked it for good measure. Infiltrating a site without walls was very different from normal location and heavily relied on misdirection. Thankfully, every member of the group was well trained and could adapt to this easily enough. The sound of heavy gunfire continued to echo from outside. The interior of the warehouse was at least the size of a football field and had an assembling line of complex industrial parts. At the end of the warehouse were a dozen 20-foot-tall robots with red steel armor over a purple armored chassis and in the shape of humanoid weapons. Rogue marched forward with a stern expression that made others want to get out of her way towards the end of the facility. According to his last reading in the astral plane, Emma's mirror was at the opposite end of the facility. Most of the engineers seemed to be in an armored room, so the few personnel in the way could be walked around for the invisible group. Using Jean's telepathy to talk with the group, Harry said, "Our invisibility should protect us from heat scanners or mutant scanners or whatever, but a mutant scanner can probably detect Rogue and those robots." Rogue interrupted him, "Sentinels, they're called Sentinels." Harry continued, "Fine, those Sentinels may detect her and they're right next to the holding cells." Rogue said, "If they see me, I'll use Mr. Rasputin's power and make some noise and draw them to the other side of the warehouse." Scott said, "All right, we'll back you up as soon as Harry gets the prisoners out." He knew that Rogue using Colossus's power made her invulnerable and she could take care of herself. Wanda and Jean held back their full strength in most training sessions, but Rogue didn't. There was no way to really hide the fact that she could use anyone's power and look weaker than she was, so she might as well practice as much as she could. Much like Harry, she was becoming a jack-of-all-trades type, so she needed a higher variation of practice anyways. Kurt said, "Shouldn't we leave once they're safe?" Scott answered, "No, Harry was right. We need to do as much damage as possible." Forge added, "And that will make an excellent distraction for our own little espionage." He mentally chuckled. Once they got closer, they saw a group of engineers setting up the Sentinels. Jean took a moment to get a read on them and said, "They're about to turn them on." A man with dwarfism in a tailored suit was shouting to the men climbing over and setting up the Sentinels. "Get these operational now. Mark 1 and 2 don't look like they're gonna last much longer. This is not a test, people." Xavier said through their link, "The teachers are engaged with 2 of these Sentinels at the main entrance. They do appear a bit buggy though, so there have been no issues so far. I cannot say the same if those doesn't reinforce them." Scott conveyed through the link, "Harry, you can break those robots, right? You're good at breaking tech." He said that last part with just a bit of humor. "If they're not shielded, I brought a dozen smoky quartz and used 3 to make us invisible. I can use the other 9 to disable the Sentinels, but I can't guarantee I can take them all out. 9 at best, 4 to 6 at worst. There really shouldn't be a way to shield them, but the team didn't need to know that." Jean, Rogue, and Wanda all turned to him and raised an eyebrow in disbelief. On a separate telepath channel, Harry conveyed, "What, did you think I was going to keep all the fun to myself?" Yes, he could take them all out, but then what would the others have to do? Rogue smirked and conveyed back, "Ah, that's so sweet, sugar." The fact that she smiled at him while looking like a buff security guard made Harry flinch. Jean rolled her eyes and conveyed through their private link, "Take out 9 to be on the safe side." Wanda conveyed, "Did Scott forget my magic can do worse things to tech than Harry's?" Harry answered, "Yep. You can cast magic without breaking tech, so you don't break it nearly as much as I do." Harry's wizard magic always broke tech, and Wanda's only did when she wanted it to, giving the false impression that Harry's was worse towards tech than her own was. Wanda cutely pouted, which made Harry want to pat her head. He reminded himself to do it later. "They're up," shouted one of the engineers. The remaining lab techs jumped off the sentinels just as they were lighting up. They all stood up and seemed far more intimidating standing upright than they did sitting down. One of them turned to face Rogue, which was a sign for the others of the group to move away from her and stand off to the side. A speaker on the robot's neck shouted, "Mutant apprehension in progress." All of the other sentinels turned to face Rogue, which confirmed that Harry's invisibility shielded them from whatever mutant detection system the robots had. What Harry found interesting was that only one of the sentinels noticed Rogue and the others just followed that one. The dwarf and all the scientists turned to see Rogue, who smiled back and lightly waved. She then transformed into a tall, beautiful, brunette woman who looked to be in her early to mid-20s. This face and body did not belong to anyone specific. All X-Men had masks and costumes to hide their identities, but Rogue took it a step further and used Mystique's power to make a completely different appearance. With practice, she was able to stay in this form without much effort, and this allowed her to fight without having to wear a mask or one of Harry's hard light disguises. Rather than run away, Rogue took the moment the sentinels charged their weapons and ran over to the shorty, calling the shots. Without warning, she knocked him out with a finger touch and picked him up. It wasn't the sentinels she concerned herself with, it was the dozen guards with energy-based weapons that were still in the warehouse. This hostage was both important and easy to carry, so he was the obvious choice of human shield. Carrying the little man, Rogue then started running over to the other side of the warehouse with the sentinels tracking her movements with their arm cannons. Their targeting system registered her as a mutant but registered the dwarf as a non-mutant, and their programming prevented them from shooting when she used him as a shield. The guards around the cages at the end of the warehouse ran after Rogue, leaving the cages unattended with their backs to the prisoners. The cages contained 6 adults, 2 teenagers, and 3 children. Harry said through the link, "Wanda, remove the separations inside the cages and unlock their manacles." Wanda fired half a dozen bolts of red light into the cells, which struck the ground beneath the bars separating the cells. The bars then appeared to liquefy, as if melted through. They weren't hot. Scott said through the link, "The invisibility is wearing off, get into position as soon as the prisoners are out." The group was going from invisible to see-through, but were gradually fading back into view. Since everyone had their backs turned, Harry figured this was a good time for his invisibility to wear off. He wasn't going to hold their hands forever after all. Harry pulled out a diamond, and after making it glow and putting it back in his inventory, he made a silver portal at the end of the cells. The blonde-haired Emma Frost was having an off day. She did not care for being suspended by chains and manacles in a cell. Shaw was in another cell and unconscious from whatever drug they used on him to stop him from struggling. She'd watched the sentinels learn as they observed his energy absorption and moved right to physical force and knockout gas. Emma didn't put up a fight, so they didn't drug her. She couldn't reach her mirror since arriving here, but the sound of fighting in the front had been promising. She'd gotten much from the minds of these men, as long as she got out of there, she'd be able to use it. She certainly hadn't expected a disguised rogue showing up, taking Boulevard Trask hostage, and getting the sentinels away from her cage. The bars melting and her boyfriend wearing his costume slowly becoming visible in front of her were also rather surprising. She unconsciously smirked at his costume but put those thoughts away. For later at least. Wanda shot a few more hex bolts, which unlocked the captured mutants. Those who were unconscious were caught by Jean's telekinesis, and Scott quietly said, "Get them through the portal." Emma didn't argue and motioned for those still conscious to run through, followed by herself. Jean lifted the unconscious ones through just as the portal closed. The students recognized the main hall of mansion through the portal, so they weren't worried about them. Dr. Kinney would be able to look after any injuries. Jean conveyed through their private link, "Isn't one of those guys a bad guy?" Harry answered, "Possibly more than one." Harry wasn't going to assume that everyone had been innocent victims before being captured. "It'll be handled," he stated. Mutants. The prisoners are escaping. One of the guards had coincidentally turned around and saw the now visible X-Men. The sentinels turned around just as Harry finished charging a spell. 9 egg-sized pieces of smoky quartz crystal levitated in front of him and glowed using the Lumos charm. Harry used the vanishing charm on them all and cast a massive field stunner. A red wave shot out from Harry's hands and the guards dropped. 8 of the sentinels emitted heavy sparks and the lights in their eyes dimmed before they fell and crashed. Harry eyed the sentinel he intended to fry which had survived. The speaker on its neck shouted once more, "Mutant apprehension in progress." Harry figured that the one which could sense mutants was shielded somehow. He'd need to look into that. The arms of the 4 sentinels shot 8 red beams of what Harry and Forge recognized as heavy ions. Basically super electricity. It could melt metal or shock flesh. Sustained use on a living person would kill, but a single shot would only injure and incapacitate. Jean and Wanda raised a psionic and magic shield as the sentinels raised their hands and the shields held back the beams. 2 of the sentinels stopped shooting and moved to approach while one turned around to attack Rogue and the last maintained firing at the shields. Scott shouted, "Hit him hard." Jean and Wanda reduced the size of their shields to only block the ion cannons, giving Scott the room to fire his I-beams. Kurt took Kitty's hand and teleported above the sentinel firing and released Kitty, who fell intangibly through the 20-foot-tall robot and a moment later walked out of its foot. Unsurprisingly, the robot stopped firing, started twitching, and small explosions were heard inside as the sentinel collapsed. Spike shot Bone Spike after Bone Spike at the approaching sentinels, but the first set bounced off the robot's red steel armor. He aimed for the joints, which allowed him to lodge his spikes into the crevices and inhibit the bot's movements. For a moment, the sentinel used its metal hand to sweep the stuck spikes away. Scott's concussion beams targeted a sentinel's head which pushed it back, showing the massive force of Scott's power, but the sentinel put a steel hand in front of the beam and by bracing itself against it, was able to move forward. A massive crashing sound echoed from the back of the warehouse where a steel-skinned rogue had used a strength-augmented fist to smash off the upper torso of the sentinel which had gone after her alone. She was holding back, showing off only until the guards were unconscious since she wanted to play around a bit with her evil, little, human shield. The 2 remaining sentinels looked back to see the destruction of the other 2. Wanda and Jean used the chance to attack. Jean created a large psionic blast and shot it across the warehouse and Wanda cast what appeared to be a bolt of red lightning. The psionic blast passed through the armor of one of the sentinels and shook it apart from the inside while Wanda's supercharged hexbolt caused the other sentinel to directly explode. Kitty, who watched the whole thing with a grin, shouted, "Who? Girl power." Referencing that the girls took out the last sentinels while the boys, besides Harry, did not contribute much to their destruction. Kurt complained, "Hey, I helped too." Kitty said, "It's okay Kurt, you can be one of the girls too." Kurt did a 3-finger facepalm and said, "Oh, why me? I never get a break." Harry and Forge were busy hacking the computers and Harry said, "It's not their fault. These things were designed to go against serious firepower. Attacking from within or using tech-disrupting attacks are the most effective unless you have the impact strength of the Juggernaut." Scott asked, "What about the teachers outside?" Xavier answered telepathically, "Already defeated." Wolverine's claws were able to penetrate their armor, forcing them on the defensive, and it only got worse for them from there. Very few sensors can easily penetrate a thick layer of fog. Forge added, "If these readings are right, then we're very lucky. Jean's and Wanda's shields are far stronger than what most can generate, and Harry was able to take out most of them at first. If not for these facts, those dozen sentinels could have made very short work of us." Most of the kids nodded. Kitty could only take one out at a time and her surprise assault was not guaranteed to work when it was no longer a surprise. After a few more moments, the door to the main entrance opened and the teachers entered from what looked to be a battlefield. The sentinels were in pieces as Wolverine had sliced off their knees, arms, and heads. Aurora looked over the large pile of sentinels and said, "My word. There were so many?" There was concern and real fear in her voice. Spike quickly said, "It's all right Auntie, Harry took out most of them in one shot and we handled the rest." Harry walked over to the sentinel that Jean took down. It was the one which had the mutant sensor and the one that survived Harry's spell. Harry said, "Logan, can you open up this one's head?" His claws came out without question and he slashed open the robot's face. Harry reached his hand inside and after a few moments, pulled out a box connected to dozens of wires. He ripped the wires off and smashed the box into the ground, revealing the content. Dr. McCoy asked, "What is that?" Harry pulled out a very small metagem emerald from the system and said, "This is mine. One of the samples I loaned out. Seems someone figured out a very creative use for it, sensing mutants. It was also singed." Apparently it acted as a lightning rod for magic, which was why the sentinel survived the spell. The implications didn't need to be said. Harry would start working on this soon. Jean said, "You're the only one who can make those, right? Please be careful with those." Harry answered back, "Emeralds can generate holograms, illusions if you will. The scanning system uses the emerald to make an illusion of a person. The problem is that the illusion gives more information about the person than a picture does, including whether or not that person has a mutation. Making an illusion of the person and scanning the illusion is how the system works." Kurt said, "Wait, isn't that the same emerald as the one in my disguise watch?" Harry nodded. "Yeah, don't lose those. If you do, a mutant scanner can be made from it." Scott said, "Then don't sell emeralds." McCoy said, "But the same technology could be used as an advanced, non-intrusive medical scanner and save thousands of lives." Harry smiled. This was a problem. But problems kept things interesting. Forge used his toys and Harry's assistants to successfully hack into the systems and lock everything down. The safe room where the remaining personnel were hiding would remain locked while they finished up. Scott, Jean, Wolverine, and Wanda were busy destroying everything that looked valuable to all but reduce it to rubble. On the computers themselves, Forge and Harry didn't delete anything. Instead, they made it look like someone tried to hack in, failed, and tried to destroy it and failed. The data on the computers was likely backed up offsite, so deleting it was useless. What they did instead was fill the computer with hidden viruses. Once the current data was connected to the offsite system so the backup could be updated, the backup would be uploaded with the viruses. The viruses would not go off then either. They would simply, slowly, infect every system connected to the computers. 1 week after the virus was uploaded, it would start to slowly scramble the data. It wouldn't even be obvious at first. The most insidious part about this was that when data seemed corrupted, the user would always try to find a backup copy of uncorrupted data. The act of doing this would infect the stores of uncorrupted data as well. Once the virus went off, the very personnel in charge of fixing it would ensure its spread. Jean and Xavier had ensured that the faces of the captured mutants in the memories of the personnel were edited. The security footage was destroyed and purged using some super electromagnets Harry carried around with him. Once everything was done and the group returned home on the Blackbird, Harry used his time turner to go back 2 hours and set up a few things. He returned to the warehouse and invisibly sat on the roof of a building overlooking the entrance of the warehouse. Soon, the fog enveloped the area. Harry's energy senses could easily see through the fog, and since all of the X-Men could be considered high level, they were all very bright. Even the energy weapons on the guards were bright, making everything visible for him. Harry saw Wolverine rush up the left side of the alley and Beast the right side. Logan backhanded or performed a rotating elbow strike on the guards' heads, knocking them unconscious, while McCoy simply smashed his largest hands together against their heads, knocking them out. With the fog clouding their vision, the guards were dropping one by one. An alarm sounded and they finally figured out something was wrong. Massive turrets rose from steel platforms and charged themselves, but they could only rotate aimlessly through the heavy fog. Harry figured they used motion sensors or thermal vision. Either would be fine in light fog, but this pea soup fog made them nearly useless. Human guards on the other hand were more than willing to open fire blindly into the fog, shooting at random and hoping for a lucky shot. Harry was magically concealing his mind so Xavier didn't sense him, but Harry did sense Xavier mentally knock out several guards, one by one. He wasn't just sitting on the sidelines in the Blackbird watching the group. He was the most powerful telepath alive after all. Mutant apprehension in progress. 2 sliding doors opened from buildings to the side of the main entrance and the massive sentinels were revealed. In the next moment they started firing their heavy ion beams. Accurately too. Harry had seen their schematics by now and knew they could target using heat, light, and sound. Sound was partially muffled by the thick fog, but at this distance it wasn't by much. Wolverine and Beast were shot and blasted back within 2 seconds. Colossus charged forward at one of them and shouted to direct their aim. He then tanked the heavy ion beam but was having trouble continuing his charge. The Sentinel then used the beam of both hands and the metal-skinned Colossus was finally pushed back. Several of the guards were still firing and Angel was sitting on the rooftop observing the rest. The fog made the turrets useless and held the fire of the guards, but it also makes his wings too damp to use effectively, and the movement of fog should he try to fly through it would give away his position to the energy weapon-wielding guards. Not everyone was useful in every fight after all. The cackle of thunder above them and the concentration of natural energy around Aurora was another reason Angel was just scouting instead of flying around. Beast was jumping around to take the aim of the second sentinel while Colossus continued trying to push against the beams of the first. Both were distracting the pair while Wolverine finished taking out the remaining guards with Xavier. The immortal mutant only took a few moments to recover from the shot and knew how to walk quietly. 3 bolts of lightning struck the head of the sentinel firing at Colossus, which stopped its beams and made it nearly fall. Nearly. It righted itself back up and looked for its target once more. The sentinels were completely shielded from most forms of energy, including heat and electricity. Harry cast a very light, finite incantatum spell at both sentinels. The spot he aimed for was the tracking system, meaning they would have lousy aim for a while. This was why the professor said the sentinels were buggy. Harry then teleported to a certain location and moments later, a portal opened and he received his guests. The location itself looked very much like Xavier's mansion, but it was not. It was a duplicate Harry had prepared in advance. Harry used a selective invisibility spell on himself when the rest became visible so the prisoners never saw him and wouldn't think there were 2 of him. Emma might find out if she looked hard enough, but she had already given up on figuring out Harry's secrets because they gave her migraines. Harry walked over to the group and started casting diagnosis spells to check their health and asked Emma, "So who are your new friends and what should we do with them?" Emma had read all of their minds as well during her stay. She pointed at the unconscious adults, all criminals and deserved to be locked up somewhere. She pointed at the other teen mutant and the 3 kids, they are simply known mutants who were easy targets. Field tests in controlled conditions. Though their powers could be useful if duplicated. Harry would leave them to the professor then. He asked, "What do you want to do with Shaw?" Emma smiled and said, "Leave him to me. I took a peek at what you've done." Apparently he was being protected by a woman named Celine and she hasn't been seen in a while. He practically outed himself several days ago and without a telepath to clean up the mess, he became a target. Harry said, "This Sentinel program won't end because of what we've done today, but it will certainly be held back. Hopefully long enough for the anti-mutant sentiment to change or until we can remove the possibility of funding." Emma threw her hand back as if it was a minor concern. "Within a year, the money that funded my little adventure will find its way into more reputable endeavors." Harry smiled but didn't ask. After what she'd been through, he wasn't going to say anything against a little payback. Harry opened a portal for Emma to return home. She took Shaw's unconscious body with her and Harry doubted he'd ever see the man again. Emma was fully capable of controlling a person and without a telepath to back and protect him, he was likely going to become a puppet and after serving his purpose, he doubted he would ever be seen again. Yachts sink so often these days. Harry then opened another portal to the actual mansion and used some light compulsions to get them to go through. Once through, he used a light memory charm to erase the moment and let the people think they'd gone from the warehouse to the mansion directly. Harry had already changed the timestamps on the cameras in the mansion so no one would notice the discrepancy. Harry had specific protocols for this type of situation and it required moving the unknowns to a safe location before moving them to the mansion. Only after scanning to make sure they didn't have any pathogens or surgically implanted bombs would he move them to the school. He had also used some stunners on the remaining knocked-out adults for good measure. A little over the top, but Harry had all the time in the world to think and came up with a lot of security measures to keep those he cared about safe. He doubted he'd get everything, but it didn't hurt to try. For now, he just had to wait for time to catch up to him. Then he would find which group lent his metagems to the Sentinel program and get as much as he could out of them. Then he'd find some time to spend with his girls. He was turning 16 soon and it was summer after all. If you want to support me, check out my Patreon at https://www.patreon.com/Kayashin. I tend to polls that decide important plot stuff in my P at Trian. Many thanks to my awesome patrons. Ben Phillips.
If you like this content, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you later, bye bye.